Hello, good evening, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning in tonight. My name is Spencer Ruchty. I am the author events manager here at Third Place Books in Seattle, Washington. On behalf of Third Place Books, I am so pleased to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Neal Stephenson and Andy Weir. They are with us tonight to talk about Neal's latest novel, Termination Shock. First of all, I want to invite all of you who are watching this evening to post something in the chat. Let us know where you're calling in from, say hello. And second of all, through virtual events like tonight's, I know we are so fortunate to continue connecting readers with authors in an intimate setting. We do sorely miss having authors in our stores, especially on nights like tonight. But at the same time, we're so thankful to have this new platform that brings our event series into your homes all across the world. So thank you again for tuning in and for supporting independent bookstores. Third Place Books is proud to host a number of exciting virtual events this fall, which you can find on our website, thirdplacebooks.com, including tomorrow night, November 17th. We are hosting Ernest Cline along with our partner bookstores at Book People and Mysterious Galaxy Bookstore for the paperback release of Ready Player 2. For reminders about these events and so much more, I encourage you to sign up for our email newsletter at thirdplacebooks.com. Tonight, we will also have some time for your questions. So during the last 15 minutes of our hour, please submit those questions to the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen, which is separate from the chat window. We also offer closed captioning for those who are interested. Just hit the live transcript button at the bottom of your window to turn this feature on and off. A reminder that your ticket to see tonight's event does include a copy of this brilliant new novel, Termination Shock, which will be ready for you to pick up at our stores or in the mail by the end of this week. So if you miss anything from our conversation tonight, please keep in mind that we'll be sending a recording to you, to everyone who purchased a ticket. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise, and if they do, we will do our best to resolve them quickly. So thank you so much for your patience and understanding. And overall, thank you for sticking around with us during this virtual era. It is really strictly because of you that this author series is even possible. And now I am very pleased and very excited to introduce tonight's speakers. Seattle's own Neal Stephenson is the best-selling author of the novels Fall or Dodge in Hell, The Rise and Fall of D.O.D.O., co-authored by Nicole Galland, and Anathem, Quicksilver, Cryptonomicon, The Diamond Age, Snow Crash, and many more, as well as the groundbreaking nonfiction work In the Beginning Was the Command Line. Stephenson is a pioneer of the cyberpunk genre, and his many accolades include the Hugo Award, the Arthur C. Clarke Award, and a Robert Heinlein Award. He is the author of some of the best works of fiction today on mathematics, cryptography, linguistics, philosophy, and the history of science. Joining Neal in conversation tonight is Andy Weir, the author of the novels The Martian, Artemis, and most recently, Project Hail Mary, which Ernest Cline called, quote, like going on a field trip to outer space with the best science teacher you've ever had, and your class assignment is to save the world. Weir is a lifelong space nerd and a devoted hobbyist of subjects such as relativistic physics, orbital mechanics, and the history of manned spaceflight. Tonight's book is Termination Shock, a prescient new novel about a near future world in which the greenhouse gas effect has resulted in superstorms, rising sea levels, global flooding, heat waves, and deadly pandemics. We are so thrilled to have these two authors with us yet again tonight. Please join me in welcoming Neal Stephenson and Andy Weir. Take it away, guys.
Hi, and thanks for that very encouraging introduction. And hi, Andy, it's good to see you. I'm sorry I look like this, but it's winter in Seattle. And this is how everybody looks at this time.
I'm here to interview Satan. He's currently in the bowels of hell, and he's going to be answering some questions about global warming. So
yeah, it's actually a good tie-in. So yeah. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. We'll see how this works. Hopefully, it won't show all my embarrassing tabs and bookmarks. Normally when I do a reading, I read from my own book for obvious reasons, but this time I'm going to try something different. I'm going to quote from some fascinating books written by other people. And as I do, I'm going to flash the covers up on the screen to give due credit to the authors and so that you can follow up if you want to read more on your own. In 536 AD, the Byzantine historian Procopius was in Italy, describing a year without a summer. During the whole year, the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, and it seemed extremely like the sun in eclipse, for the beams it emitted were not clear like those it usually makes. John of Ephesus reported similar phenomena in the eastern part of the empire. The sun darkened and stayed covered with darkness a year and a half. Although rays were visible around it for 2 or 3 hours a day, they were as if diseased, with the result that fruits did not reach full ripeness. All the wine had the taste of reject grapes. John Lydas, a Byzantine official, posited a physics-based explanation. The sun becomes dim because the air is dense from rising moisture, as happened in the course of the recently passed 14th indiction, which is to say 535 and 536, for nearly a whole year. Cassiodorus, at the same time, wrote, "How strange it is, I ask you, to see the sun, but not its usual brightness, to gaze on the moon, glory of the night, at its full, but shorn of its natural splendor. We are all still observing a sun as blue as the sea. We marvel at bodies that cast no shadow at midday, and at the force of strongest heat reduced all the way to the impotence of extreme mildness. And this is not the brief absence of an eclipse, but as one that has taken place for nothing short of almost the whole year. We have had a winter without storms, a spring without mildness, a summer without heat." There was no way that these writers could have known it, but the events they were describing were triggered by 2 or 3 massive volcanic eruptions elsewhere in the world that all happened to occur in a span of a few years, beginning around 536. One might have been in Iceland, another somewhere in the tropics. One was definitely at Ilopango in what is now El Salvador. Ilopango alone produced 87 cubic kilometers of ejecta and had devastating effects on the Mayans. At the same time, up in Scandinavia, a culture was dying out. This was a precursor culture to what we later called the Vikings. Historians have debated why this culture disappeared, and there were probably a number of reasons, but it couldn't have helped that in a part of the world that was already famous for cold weather and marginal agriculture, they got hit with a series of incredibly cold winters. No direct accounts survive, but the Nordic cultures that arose afterwards may have preserved some cultural memory of the event in their stories. For them, the end of the world would come not in fire, but in ice, a terrible winter called Fimbulvinter. Here's a passage from the Edda. "First of all, that a winter will come called Fimbulvinter. Then snow will drift from all directions. There will then be great frosts and keen winds. The sun will do no good. There will be 3 of these winters together and no summer between." Another Eddic poem, the Seeress's Prophecy, states, "Black become the sun's beams in the summers that follow. Weather's all treacherous. The sun starts to blacken. As the sun vanishes, the stars fall into the sea where their heat raises a great steam that covers the sky." The Finnish Kalevala contains the following. "What wonder blocks out the moon? What fog is in the sun's way that the moon gleams not at all and the sun shines not at all?" Parenthetically, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out what's probably obvious to all of you, which is that these legends of anomalous long winters that change the course of human destiny are, of course, fundamental to George R.R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire, aka Game of Thrones. Doom by Neil Ferguson catalogs several post-volcanic winters. An eruption in Peru in 1600 was followed by severe winters in Scandinavia and a famine in Russia. A 1640 eruption in Japan led not only to cold summers and failed harvests in its vicinity, but droughts in Greece, Egypt, India, and other places. After the 1783 eruption of Laki, a volcano in Iceland, Benjamin Franklin wrote of a constant fog over Europe and parts of North America. The Mississippi froze at New Orleans, and the resulting food shortages helped touch off the French Revolution. 1816 was called the year without a summer because of the eruption of Tambora in Indonesia. It and the earlier Laki eruption in Iceland are basically tied for the modern record. Each put about 110 million tons of sulfate into the air. The Long Now Foundation, where I'm going to be appearing tomorrow, owns property that's home to a number of ancient bristlecone pine trees. Researchers have been able to sample these and use tree ring analysis to see how the growth rate varied from year to year as a result of changes in weather. Sometimes the effects are obvious enough that anyone can just see them by looking at a slice of the wood, but there are also special staining techniques that can make the changes more obvious. 2036 BCE was apparently marked by a large volcanic eruption that left a clear discontinuity in the sample on the left. The sample on the right shows a couple of anomalous years around 1419 BCE. You can identify them from the blue fringes in the staining. What's being plotted here is the thickness of tree rings from one specific tree, which gives you an idea of growing conditions year by year. A higher value suggests a better growing season. A low value suggests that the weather was bad. I've superimposed some vertical red lines showing the dates of some of the big eruptions mentioned in Neil Ferguson's book. Some big drops are observable in years following some big eruptions, notably Lombok, Indonesia, which is the leftmost one, and the Peruvian eruption, which is the third from the left. In other cases, the correlation isn't as obvious. Here's a similar chart done better. In the lower part of the chart, you're seeing two plots, a bunch of spikes drawn in black showing the amount of volcanic aerosols in the atmosphere year by year, and another plot in blue showing how much the temperature deviated from average. And again, the correlations aren't always perfectly one for one. This is just to say that volcanic eruptions do affect climate, but it's never simple. For any given site on the surface of the globe where you're gathering data, the effect from a given volcano depends very much on where that volcano is located. Laki and Tambora were of equal size, but at least here in the Great Basin, where these trees were growing, Tambora, which is just after 1800, had a far larger impact than Laki in 1783. At the other end of the 19th century, Edvard Munch painted this famous masterpiece. The dramatic red sky in the background is open to interpretation, of course, but the painting was made not long after the eruption of Krakatoa, which depressed temperatures all over the world and created spectacular sunsets like this one for a couple of years afterwards. In the 1960s, yet another eruption in Indonesia put a plume of ejecta into the atmosphere. The Australians got a plane in the air to take samples. When it landed, they noticed a deposit on the windscreen. One of the Australian scientists licked it and reported that it was painfully acid. A more sophisticated analysis found that it was sulfates, sulfuric acid, basically.
More sophisticated than licking it?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That seems pretty sophisticated.
Well, I like the style of it. It's not wrong. In 1991, when Mount Pinatubo erupted in the Philippines, it was possible to gather a lot more data beyond the now familiar phenomena of depressed global temperatures and brilliant sunsets. So this is all pretty well understood. When sulfur dioxide is injected into the stratosphere, it combines with available water to form sulfuric acid, which drifts around in the form of a very large number of tiny droplets. When such a droplet is struck by light from the sun, some of the light will bounce back into space, so it never reaches the troposphere where weather happens, and it can't warm up the planet. Some of the light will be deflected sideways. This contributes to a general brightening of the sky that explains the beautiful sunsets, as well as some of the atmospheric phenomena described by those Byzantine and Scandinavian sources, as well as none other than Benjamin Franklin. And some of the light keeps going down and continues to warm the Earth as usual. This keeps happening for a couple of years, which is how long it takes for the sulfates to wash out of the atmosphere. Sulfates have remarkable leverage against global temperatures. The amount of sulfates needed to cool down the Earth by 1 or 2 degrees simply isn't that large. So it's easy to imagine engineered delivery systems that would duplicate what volcanoes have done many times in the past. high altitude tanker planes, high altitude balloons, and big guns have all been mentioned. This kind of thing goes under the name solar geoengineering. It's a perfectly well-known concept among scientists who study these things, but it doesn't get talked about much because it's controversial. And I think, as we all know, the state of public discourse right now is such that people tend to shy away from saying what they're thinking. Unfortunately, the CO2 level in the atmosphere doesn't care what we're thinking. It keeps on rising regardless. This is a screen grab from just a few days ago showing that the current level is about 414 parts per million. That's up from 411 in just the last year. The graph on the lower right just happens to begin around the time I was born, and it shows that during my lifetime, it's gone from below 320 parts per million to almost 420. And look at the shape of that curve. Not only is it going up, which means that the problem is getting worse, but it's got a little upward curve to it, indicating that the pace at which it's getting worse is accelerating. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, this number was in the mid 200s. Today, it's the highest it has been since a few million years ago, when the world had a completely different climate. Various governments have announced plans to cut back on CO2 emissions. China, for example, is saying that by 2030, their emissions will level off. In other words, if they do that and every other country in the world does likewise, the CO2 level at that point will become a mere linear function of time. It'll still be going up, but the rate won't be increasing. This plot will no longer have that slight upward curve. It'll just be a straight line angling upwards. By something like 2060 or 2070, it's hoped that the world economy might reach net zero carbon emissions, but this doesn't solve the problem. It'll just turn this curve into a flat horizontal line. If the CO2 level in the atmosphere is, say, 500 parts per million in 2070, it'll remain at 500 until natural processes can bring it back down again, which is expected to take on the order of about 1 million years. There are a lot of ways in which this is bad, but perhaps the most serious threat that we can expect to see materialize in coming years is that of so-called wet bulb disasters, in which temperature and humidity both get so high as to make the survival of humans a physical impossibility. Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future opens with a harrowing description of one such event in India. So this all sounds pretty bad and kind of like the thing that a well-ordered society would mount an effective response to, but we're at the end of almost 2 years of a global pandemic in which a significant fraction of people refuse to believe in the existence of a disease that is killing people all around them in the hundreds of thousands. So from all of this, it's completely obvious that the human race is going to have to build carbon capture technologies on an incredibly massive scale. If you think of this in terms of all the coal mines that have been hollowed out of the Earth's crust, all the petroleum deposits that have been drained, all of the forests and peat bogs that have been burned, basically we have to fill those back up again with stable carbon-containing compounds that we will have to manufacture. We'll need to do it fast. It will be by far the largest engineering project in the history of the world. I believe that we will do it and that 100 years from now, this problem will have been solved. Atmospheric CO2 levels will be back to where they were before the Industrial Revolution. That's the good news. The bad news is that it's going to take decades, and during that time, we are going to begin seeing disastrous events such as the one depicted in the Ministry for the Future. On those rare occasions when people talk about solar geoengineering at all, it's conventional to describe it as an idea that's on the extreme fringe and that deserves to be there because it seems so dangerous. Much more research is needed, is the usual conclusion. I do wonder whether it will continue to seem all that dangerous a decade or two down the road when climate disasters are leading directly to mass fatalities, particularly given the fact that nature has already performed the experiment for us on several occasions. And we know that the sulfates naturally wash out of the atmosphere in a couple of years. Danger is always relative. Jumping out of a moving car is dangerous, but people will do it anyway if the car is about to go over a cliff. In my book, Termination Shock, an individual billionaire constructs a large gun that shoots sulfur into the stratosphere, simulating what volcanoes do. this is already a fait accompli at the beginning of the story. And so what it's mostly about is how people react to it. Needless to say, not everyone is happy. Just to give some sense of scale, the amount of sulfur that this fictional gun is capable of launching over the course of a year's continuous operation is about 1% of what Mount Pinatubo put into the air explosively. But in his mind, it's just a pilot project, and the plan is to build more such facilities in other parts of the world. Now we're going to turn it over to conversation and Q&A, but before we do, I just wanted to flash up the URL for ComancheEagle.org. How this is relevant to termination shock won't be obvious until you get deeper into the book. They haven't endorsed my book in any way, so I'm not claiming that, but I'm endorsing them as a remarkable organization that's doing important work, not just in preservation of raptors, but also in curating many other records and artifacts of the Comanche tribe. They don't like to call them artifacts, they say life objects. This is an older Flash website, but if you skip the intro, you'll be taken to this page with its all-important donate button on the right, ComancheEagle.org. Thank you. And we're back.
All right. Well,
Okay.
Thank you for that presentation, Neil. And
Sure.
there will be a quiz at the end of the session, so I hope you all remember everything from that. So, yeah, I mean, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you.
That was an awesome presentation. I remember the Pinatubo eruption in the 90s. I was in college at the time. In my dorm room, by sheer ridiculous luck, I ended up with a dorm room on the 6th floor at UC San Diego, and that it looked out over the ocean. So every night, my roommate and I got these just unbelievable sunsets every night. We would just stop what we were doing and watch the sunset.
Yeah, so that was light being sort of deflected sideways by these droplets of sulfuric acid in the stratosphere. I don't know if you knew that at the time, but
at the time I did not know that, but now I know it thanks to your presentation.
Now you know.
You're a science educator.
Yeah.
So I've got a couple of random questions for you, but
Sure.
You're welcome to just
Ignore you.
take it. Yeah, right. Ignore me and say whatever you want. But I guess I should start with the standard question that all authors get, that all authors kind of hate, and you've answered 1,000 times, but let's do it anyway. Give us the elevator pitch for termination shock. Tell us about what this book is.
Okay, trying to dodge spoilers as much as possible.
Avoid spoilers. Yeah.
It's a billionaire, not one of your tech billionaires, but an old school billionaire who came out of the oil, gas, and mining industry in Texas, who decides that he's just going to do something about all of this global warming nonsense. He's got a lot of property in Houston, which is continually under threat from sea level rise and hurricanes. And he makes the calculation that if he can slow down the rise of sea level, that alone will improve the value of his Houston real estate portfolio enough to pay for the whole project. So he builds the world's biggest gun, and he starts launching sulfur into the atmosphere, which is, I think, a fairly unrealistic thing, but it makes for good storytelling. And as part of this, he's trying to enlist the aid of a number of other people in the world that he thinks might have similar interests, similar incentives. So he's talking to people from the Netherlands, from the city of London, from Venice, from Singapore, basically small, wealthy, technocratic places that are under direct threat from sea level rise, and that he thinks might have the wherewithal to contribute some of their influence and their cash to building more of these facilities. But not everyone is on board with his plan,
right?
And so hilarity ensues.
I'm not sure about It's not the sort of hilarity you'd want to be a part of. Um, so this book goes like all over the place. This is an ensemble kind of cast. I mean, obviously the billionaire is central, but you're all over the place. I mean, I don't mean that in a bad way. You're literally all over the world. Things are taking place all over the world. I was kind of wondering if you have a favorite character, like out of the aside from the obvious protagonists. Like, do you have one that's your favorite?
You know, I like all of these people, or not all of them, but I like a lot of them. So we've got a Rufus, who's a lonesome cowboy who gets pulled into the story through the side door, as it were, and becomes a central figure. I'm fond of him. We've got Willem, who's an aide, senior aide to the Queen of the Netherlands. We've got the Queen of the Netherlands herself. We've got Cornelia, who's a Venetian nationalist. She's from a very fancy old family in Venice, and they're kind of looking at the whole crisis as a possible way for Venice to regain its status as an independent city-state.
It's like, haha, joke's on you. We're already underwater.
Right.
Yeah, that doesn't bother us at all.
Yeah. And we've got Big Fish, who's a Canadian of Punjabi ancestry who gets sort of pulled into this through a bizarre series of circumstances that's hard to explain, but it has to do with the geopolitical conflict.
It's a little spoilery.
Yeah. So we won't talk about him. So
I do think it's worth noting that both of us in our recent books have a fairly powerful, somewhat pushy Dutch woman.
Yeah, I noticed that when I was reading Hail Mary. I was like, oh, God damn it. Andy beat me to it.
They're very different.
I have to write faster.
They're very different characters.
Yeah,
though.
they are very different. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So I want to ask you, sometimes when categorizing types of books and types of stories, some authors will bristle at some terms, other authors will happily embrace it. How do you feel about the term cli-fi?
Well, in general, I'm a happy embracer kind of guy because I think that a lot of these classifications are basically made up by booksellers to make it easier to sell books. And I'm strongly in favor of books being sold.
Especially your books.
Yeah. I've actually somewhat avoided cli-fi, not because I'm not interested in it. Obviously, I'm super interested in it, but I tend to shy away from books that are on topics that I'm currently engaged with for kind of like probably obvious reasons.
You don't want to get tainted. I do the same thing.
Yeah. So I didn't order Stan's book, Kim Stanley Robinson's book, until I was done with this one. Although obviously I knew it was out there. So I'm again totally fine with. I mean, my job is to write them. I'm not the expert on selling them. If somebody who's an expert on selling books tells me that calling it cli-fi is good for selling books, then I'm like, go for it.
Go for it.
Yeah.
Well, I would remind everyone that paper is made from wood, and so if you buy our books, you're participating in carbon sequestration. So you're helping
as long as you don't burn them.
As long as you don't burn them. So don't burn them. Every sheet, and you've really gone the distance on this one, Neil. There's a lot of carbon sequestration in this book, 708 pages worth.
So it's shorter than some of mine, but over my career, I've sequestered a lot of carbon.
So have you ever considered solving the climate crisis, Neil, by just ordering all the world leaders to take the appropriate actions in an ancient Sumerian language that automatically must be obeyed? I was just wondering if that had ever occurred to you.
It's a new one on me, but now that you mention it, it would probably be more productive than what we've been seeing. I mean, to be serious for a second, any action that comes out of these conferences like Glasgow that leads to emission reductions or even zero carbon is great and to be applauded and wonderful, and we should totally do it. But I just worry that some people might see these targets being talked about as here's what we're going to do, and not quite get the fact that even if all of this happens, we're still saddled with 200 years worth of massive CO2 emissions that's not going to go away until we take it out by building giant machines, basically. So,
well, step one, many people would say step one is try to stop making it worse.
Yeah.
And that's what we're working on right now. And then, so it's kind of like if a patient comes into the ER with an artery severed that's squirting blood, it's like, okay, first deal with that.
Yeah.
Then see what else is going on.
Yeah, but in that analogy, you do multiple things at once. You'd certainly stop the squirting, but you'd also start transfusions and other take other actions, right? So we kind of have to do everything at once, I think.
So did you run the numbers on? I'm genuinely curious. Did you actually run the numbers on how much sulfur would be required to have? I know that climatology is an incredibly complicated field. Yeah. It's like I confine myself to kind of physics, Newtonian and relativistic, and those are compared to climatology.
Very simple.
Very simple. They're much more deterministic with much more predictable answers. So I was wondering, what kind of how deep down that rabbit hole did you go?
Well, actually, it's a super interesting question because there's a couple levels on which you can tackle this. And one is just to say, okay, how much sulfates did Pinatubo or whatever put into the atmosphere? All right, we kind of know what that does in terms of global temperatures. What would it take for us to artificially put a similar amount of sulfates into the stratosphere? So that is you and I, being the kinds of people we are, can kind of get our arms around that real fast. And that's the scenario that's in this book. It's just a gun that puts a certain amount of sulfur into the atmosphere over a certain period of time. However, the other thing that you're alluding to is that to really know how this would affect different areas in different ways, you have to run these very sophisticated computational fluid dynamics simulations, which do exist. I actually I started going down that rabbit hole and trying to see if I could find somebody to run an actual simulation of this scenario. So not just general, but in this location in West Texas, if this amount of sulfur was put into the air, how would it affect different regions of the globe? Because my thinking was, okay, if we could run that simulation and identify one area that would be really fucked, then that's great material for a book, right? I mean that's just almost writes itself. As it turns out, I wasn't able to get to make that all happen fast enough. So deadlines caught up with me, and so I just made some shit up, which is
that's your job.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh man. So I mean, my recent book tangentially includes the climate, although it's not it's tangential, and I don't get I wanted to go like, oh, okay, if the sun's luminosity went down, how would it affect the Earth? And I started to research that, and I'm like, oh my God,
Yeah.
this is like a rabbit hole I will never emerge from. So I just,
Yeah.
I just,
Yeah.
I just made stuff up.
Right. It's not that you can't.
Yeah.
If you could, if it wasn't possible to do it, you would just okay, well, too bad.
Mm-hmm.
But the what you discovered and I discovered is that you actually can run pretty sophisticated simulations in principle, but it's a rabbit hole, a million miles deep. Yeah. So I'd love to do that, but and I'm sure that. So I think what would actually happen if someone began to actually do this is that everyone would begin running those simulations and begin to predict, okay, this is going to be amazing for Venice, and Glasgow and Houston, but it's really going to suck for Miami and Mogadishu and Perth, Australia, and so, or whatever. And so, and then out of that, you could generate kind of the responses that those people and those governments would have to the idea.
Yeah. Well, that presupposes that the people in the governments are willing to believe the models, and then also willing to do what's necessary to stave off, even if they, it's difficult. I guess one of the main challenges with addressing climate issues is that it's a global problem, and we don't have a global government.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't, if you have a bunch of housemates and 3 of them don't mind like using the barbecue indoors,
yeah,
everybody's badly affected.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and even in the United States, there's regional differences where, if you're in Miami, you really need to pay attention to sea level rise because there's no way to stop it. The whole city's built on a sponge, and even if you built walls around it, the water would come in
under
anyway.
it.
Whereas if you're in San Francisco, all you need to do is, because the topography is so steep, you only need to withdraw a little bit to,
Quite, as someone who lives in the Bay Area, I can tell you about something like 30 to 40% of San Francisco is built on artificial fill into the bay.
Yeah.
So I think that's all going to become problematic real estate in the future. But right. Like I said, as we discussed, I'm not a climatologist, and I could not even begin to guess at how that's going to go.
Well, sea level rise is one area where it does cash out in a very clear, obvious way.
Right. So I was just saying, I don't know how the reclaimed land is going to respond to sea level rise. Like if it's going to start dissolving into the ocean, or if it's going to be fine.
Is it porous? Will the water? You get these things called sand boils around levees where you've built a levee to stop the floodwaters, but the
pressure pushes it under and over. Yeah. Well, of course, and here in San Francisco, the Bay Area, we get earthquakes, and that reclaimed land is wet enough that it does liquefaction. So basically, during the earthquake, it basically, all the land that you thought was nice and solid becomes kind of like a swamp, and everything sinks into it, and then it gets solid again when it stops shaking. And everybody's like, "What the hell just happened?"
Yeah. After our big earthquake here, the Nisqually quake, we've got a chunk of Seattle that's the same thing, and I remember seeing like trucks that had sunk partly into the earth when it was liquefied, and then now they're stuck there because after the quake,
solidified.
Right.
You can see where the ancient mythologies come from of like the earth swallowing the city. Yeah.
So
I don't know exactly when we're supposed to go to questions. Before we do, is there anything at all that you wanted to share with the audience before we start rolling into the questions here?
No, just I think I've covered it. I mean, there's this. I think I've covered it, so I think we should just go to
All right.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just going to go through them kind of in the order they were asked. Jerry Wassinger asks, do you guys consider books like The Martian and Seven Eves science fiction or just fiction? So it's kind of that similar to that labeling discussion you were talking about earlier.
I would say, I mean, I hate to be this way, but whatever causes people to buy books works for me.
I'm perfectly happy with the moniker science fiction. Yeah. And I don't know why some subgroup of authors have decided that they're offended by the term sci-fi instead of people saying the word science fiction. I don't care. Say sci-fi. Yeah. I'm a sci-fi guy. Yeah. I grew up reading sci-fi and calling it sci-fi.
I didn't know about that.
Yeah. This question comes from anonymous attendee. Mm-hmm. And this one's for you, obviously. As one of the fathers of the metaverse, do you see a path toward a more open-sourced and communally built metaverse versus the current controlled corporate-led trajectory we have with Facebook/Meta, Unity, and Microsoft? So take it away, Neil.
I'm just processing the grouping of Facebook, Unity, and Microsoft. I guess like my one kind of like basic answer to this question is that the only thing that matters at the end is how these people make money. Mm-hmm. And so, any service that's free to use, like the Facebook products, you need to ask yourself as a user, why is Facebook so rich? Why do the people, why is Zuck a billionaire when they're not charging you any money? Like, how can that work? Well, so it's free, and yet they're rich. So
yeah. Well, the old adage, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product.
You are the product, right? Or as there's a line in one of the Harry Potter books where I think it's Mrs. Weasley says, never trust anything if you can't make out where it keeps its brain. So never trust anything if you can't make out how it's making money. So I guess what I would focus on is that, and so I'm automatically mistrustful of any version of this that appears or claims to be free. So that's my answer.
Cool. Next one up, paraphrasing, another one from Jerry Wassinger is, are you familiar with the Spin Launch company and their technology? And kind of, what do you think about that?
It looks like there's an earlier thing called the Slingatron that worked on the same principle. So for those of you who don't know it, this is a type of launch, a mechanical launch device that
it's basically a large centrifuge. I'm just explaining to the audience. Obviously, you know this. It's basically a large centrifuge that releases a projectile very, very fast. It spins it up in a vacuum at on the ground, and then releases a projectile very quickly at hypersonic speeds, and that gets the projectile up through a chunk of the atmosphere. Then it sheds its cowling and has a second stage engine that actually puts it into orbit. But it's that first couple of kilometers that's the hardest, and that's what takes the vast majority of a rocket engine of a rocket's volume and mass. So their idea is for things that can handle something like 1,000 Gs or 10,000 Gs, like electronics, satellites, and so on, they could launch it this way much more cheaply. It's an interesting concept, and they pointed out that while 1,000 Gs may sound like an enormous amount of force, and certainly it would kill you, just off-the-shelf mobile devices can survive that without too much trouble.
Thank you so much for carrying the burden of that explanation. Yes, so it's a big machine that makes things go fast, and there's variations on this, like big guns and rail guns and so on, that kind of all do the same thing, which is, it's a large object on the ground that it acts like a gun. It shoots projectiles fast. And the problem is exactly what Andy just described, which is that when that projectile leaves the muzzle of the gun and encounters the atmosphere, there's going to be an incredibly violent deceleration. And so it would turn any biological system into gravy. Yeah, there would just be nothing left.
Maybe a tardigrade? Probably not, though. Not even them.
Yeah. So as long as you keep that in mind, it could work, I guess, as a replacement for the first stage of a rocket.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's any way to launch anything all the way to orbit.
No, that'd be absurd. Not from Earth's surface.
Yeah.
But the concept would work great from the moon, for instance. But
right.
So next up, as an author, how do you feel about, okay, I'm going to read the question, but I don't necessarily agree with the assumptions in the question.
Okay.
As an author, how do you feel about the relative unfilmability nature of your works? And since Andy is nice enough to host, compared to his work as well. Well, I would challenge the claim that your works are unfilmable. I think plenty of your works would translate very well into film.
My friends and I refer to this as the curse in capital letters. I think there's a huge amount. It's a hugely high variance kind of process. And so there's so many random elements that enter into how these things are developed, and how they eventually make their way or don't to the screen. So it really is a roll of the dice for any given individual project. I don't know if there's anything inherent to my work that's unfilmable, or if it's just kind of a statistical cluster. Nothing fakes people out like statistical clusters.
Yeah. And I mean, as someone who's been on the lucky side of it, it's seemingly random what does and doesn't end up making it all the way through the Hollywood system.
Yeah.
So I don't think and it has little, if anything, to do with the quality of the work.
It's all over the map. Yeah, and then the weirdest things can derail a project. It has to do with the internal politics of studios and who's in and who's out, and
exactly. Yeah, it's really unpredictable. So next one comes from Aaron Mackey, and he says, Neil, not only have I enjoyed reading your books for escapism and fabulous character development, but as a molecular and computational biologist, I've continued to learn and be inspired by the hard science you bring to the stories. Especially appreciated your treatment of epigenetics and chromatin remodeling in 70s. The technical capabilities in fall required a stretch of limits to our imagination. So I'm curious where the carbon fixing tech in this new book falls, if it does.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, super interesting question. In fall, I'll just say right out that I wasn't trying to be very technically rigorous. That was more of a fable. I was just going, okay, what if we could scan human brains and bring them back? In the case of the scenario that's depicted in Termination Shock, it's not carbon fixing.
Right.
It's solar geoengineering.
Yeah, it's global cooling. It's deliberate global cooling.
Yeah, as a stopgap measure. So anyone who knows anything about this will immediately tell you that it doesn't solve the underlying problem, which is too much CO2. It's just to go back to Andy's analogy, it's like that person who's got a spurting arterial bleed needs to have a tourniquet applied, while they get to the emergency room. But it would be malpractice to apply the tourniquet and then send them home.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just keep this thing tight. Hope for the best.
And good luck.
Yeah. Oh.
There may be some necrosis.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. But yeah. So the so solar geoengineering is what's described in termination shock. Carbon capture is what we really need. There are a lot of ideas for how to do that. And I'm just within the last few weeks starting to see people I know or I've been loosely connected to in the tech world kind of like actually quitting their jobs or suddenly swerving significant amounts of their mental time and energy into thinking about carbon capture. So there's a bunch of ways that carbon capture could be done. You could use biological processes. You could use just geophysical processes. And no one really knows what the right answer is yet. But what we do know is that whatever it is, it's got to be implemented on an incredibly gigantic scale.
Well, there's already always carbon capture going on. The problem is we're outrunning it,
right,
with carbon production. I mean, yeah. All the algae in the ocean, the trees in the forest, so they're all doing carbon capture. They're just not capturing it as fast as we're putting it out.
So if
you can find a way to equalize that.
Right.
So I'm going to skip over a couple of questions that you have already answered effectively. So there's some kind of dupes. Yes, Lisa Bono asks, would you please expand on how the current public response to the pandemic affected the creation of your new book? And then she adds, thanks. So she's very courteous, unlike the other questions who just bark out their question. Yeah. Lisa said thank you in advance. So that's very nice.
Well, you're very welcome, Lisa, and your courtesy is noted and warmly appreciated. I started writing the book pre-pandemic, and then the pandemic hit and completely screwed up all of my plans because I was going to go visit some locations and do some research, and that yeah. So basically every time I made up my mind to go somewhere, a huge flare up of COVID would happen right where I was going to go. So and so I began writing it into the book at one point, and there were actually earlier drafts of this book where it's mentioned a lot more in a lot more detail. But then later on, as I began to reread those drafts, it just seemed intrusive and kind of not that interesting. Like, it may be technically correct to read lots of detail about people wearing masks, but we're all sick of wearing masks. Even if we agree, it's like no one wants to. So I sort of dialed that back quite a bit. I would say the most kind of lingering effect of that whole scene is kind of on a more basic level, which is how can we as a society deal with something as abstract and complicated as climate change when there are literally people dying of COVID, like with their last words before the ventilator gets strapped onto their face are denying that it's a real thing. So if that level of denial of scientific reality is that widespread, and if people are so dedicated to it that they're literally willing to die and see their families die rather than change their minds, then we have to take that into account when we're thinking about how to talk about climate change and what strategies might and might not work. So I'm sorry to give such an unbelievably depressing answer to your nice question, but that's the answer.
I'm going to skip over questions that are directed at me and don't have a lot to do with you. Let's see. I'm reading these just now. So, okay. I feel like you just answered this one. Yeah. Okay. Yep. So I mean, we partially know the answer to this, but is it John Niemann? I'm sorry, Niemanich. I'm definitely getting that wrong. But anyway, John asks, do you consult with scientists about the science facts of your books? And who are these folks? Well, I know you talk to some folks, but who are they?
I mean,
what are their home addresses?
No. I mean, the nice thing about scientists is that they publish their stuff. So, and in a lot of cases, they're in situations where it may not be in their best interests, really, sort of career-wise, to be seen as helping crazy novelists write wacky books. So, I don't know if you've had this experience.
No, I haven't had anyone say like, okay, I'll tell you, but you got to keep my name out of it, you know.
Okay.
But I don't write books that anyone anywhere would consider controversial. And unfortunately, a book about climate change is inherently controversial, which is a sad truth in itself. So I can understand why they might feel that way about.
Yeah. So I try to glean what I can from what people have published, but it's in the nature of science to, I mean, that's what science is, it's publishing things. And so it's not like you can go and, you know, go through the back door and talk to a scientist and get secret privileged information that right. They wouldn't tell anyone else, because that's not what scientists do. They kind of do the opposite of that. So so in general, I feel like I'm able to tap into what's going on in this area simply by reading what's already out there on the internet. And I don't have to bother them and waste their time and put them in an awkward position by sort of doing private consultations.
So we're running short on time, so I'm now skimming the questions. There are lots of them, and I'm just looking for the ones that I arbitrarily think are more interesting than others. So I apologize to anyone I'm skipping over. We just don't have time to get to all of them. But here's an interesting one. Amy Smith Bell asks, your novels often use time spans as a key part of the story, 70s and Cryptonomicon. When you're thinking of a story, do you start by thinking of the time span you want to work with, or does that organically come for the length of time the story needs to come to fruition?
That's an interesting question.
Yeah, I thought so.
Yeah. It tends to be not a thing I think about a priori. I mean, it might emerge from the story of what I'm writing. So in the case of Seven Eves, it's automatic that there has to be a big gap in time to get from the setup to the payoff. And in the case of Termination Shock, it was kind of an interesting question because I wanted to show the beginnings of what this guy was doing, of creating this geoengineering scheme, because it's interesting to show things when they're starting out and when they're new. But it takes a certain amount of time for the effects to kick in. And so I had to make a decision about what that time gap was going to be. If it's too long of a span of time, then it feels like you have to start the whole story all over again with new characters, and you've got to do all kinds of tedious recapping. During the previous 10 years, So I kind of picked a intermediate span of time that was long enough where some effects would have come to light to make it interesting, but not so long that it felt like it was necessary to kind of reboot the story from a dead stop.
Okay, well, we're getting word from Third Place Books that we've got to go. That I'm going to try to sneak in one more question.
Yeah, please do. I was going to say.
Let me just, yeah. Boy, there are just so many here. Okay. I guess I will ask this one. Okay. And sorry to everybody whose question didn't get asked. There's a lot of good ones here, but we're just out of time. So an anonymous attendee asks, Neil, what has surprised you the most about these past 2 years of the pandemic? Like some things you could probably see coming, but what surprised you the most?
Well, two things. One is I already mentioned, which is that people can literally be dying of this
and not believe in it,
or seeing their loved ones die. So that, I mean, even with everything we've seen prior to that, that still blew me away. Then the other thing is kind of the sort of how the apocalypse is not evenly distributed. You know, like we've got lots of people who've just simply adapted to the new reality. So just today, Spencer and I were standing outside a door. We were trying to get into a door to go so I could sign some books, and there was a guy sitting near us, and he got up and moved because he didn't want to be in the same space with us.
It's become, and it might not have even been driven by his own desire for safety. It has now become polite to do that. Like,
right. To just create greater space when you can. And there's no fuss. There was no drama. There's no, no communication. It's just, okay, I'm going to move to this other table now. And that's just one tiny example of how, on the one hand, you have people who have died, like hundreds of thousands of people who've died, and even many
millions,
more people, who've had loved ones die. So for them, it's as bad as a thing can be, right? It's kind of truly apocalyptic. But for a lot of us who, it's just a thing that in a surprisingly short period of time we've adapted to.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So Julian Fellows, who created Downton Abbey, Downton Abbey takes place in the 1920s, predominantly in the UK. And he mentioned one thing that they always try to be as historically accurate as possible. And back then in the 20s in Britain, stuff like that, people rarely shook hands. They almost never hugged. They didn't have much physical contact with each other. That's just not the way people did that. And the reason for that was because of the Spanish flu epidemic that had happened just earlier. So we're seeing kind of similar things happen now.
Yeah, we're more kind of formal and
But I think Spencer wants us to wrap it up now.
No, this is first of all, I just want to thank the two of you. This has been such a fascinating, wonderful conversation. Thank you, of course, to everyone who's attending tonight. Your copies of Termination Shock are currently being prepared. They are all signed. For those of you who requested personalizations, Neil was kind enough to come in and personalize those today. Over 250 books. And that
one guy went and sat somewhere else.
Right. And then there was that one guy who had no idea what was going on. He had no idea what he was witnessing. And of course, I'm going to post this in the chat one more time. Andy's book, Project Hail Mary, is wonderful. If you love The Martian, you will absolutely devour this book. Do either of you have any final words before we close up the night?
No, just thanks to Third Place Books, and thanks to Andy for
wonderful
for spending some of his scarce, now extremely scarce and valuable time.
Yes, for those of you in the audience, my wife and I just had a baby, so we're I'm busy all the time right now. So that's what Neil's talking about. But it's a pleasure to be here, and it's always fun talking to you, Neil. I'm looking forward to the post-pandemic days when we can meet up in person again like we used to.
That'd be great.
As am I. Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone. On behalf of the store and myself, have a wonderful evening, and please be well.
Thank you. Bye-bye.